So, okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today for the celebration of the release of our 16th Connecticut State of the Birds report. This is the fifth report since I've come to Connecticut Audubon Society in 2017. And we've entitled the report 3 billion fewer birds and what we can do about it. And the starting point for the report is a study published in Science in September 2019, which was written by 11 top ornithologists in the US and Canada. And it shows that over the last 50 years that North America has lost about 30% of its birds. In other words, there are 3 billion fewer birds in North America today than there were in 1970. Of course, that is concerning. This State of the Birds, Connecticut State of the Birds 2021, is a call to action for our state's response to this crisis. It focuses on our role in the conservation of birds, how Connecticut can help to reverse population declines of certain species. It focuses on 6 species that nest, spend the winter, or migrate through Connecticut, for which Connecticut provides significant habitat for, and on the scientists who are working to understand why they have declined and how to best conserve them. This report shows that the work the work that has been done to bring back birds has benefits far beyond birds. Connecticut has an opportunity to protect and improve our open land, to bring birds back, and to help to achieve the state's goals for reducing the carbon that is causing climate change. Our forests, our tidal marshes, other critical habitat also provide really essential sequestration functions, taking that carbon out of the atmosphere and locking it into a more stable form. It shows that the work to bring birds back focuses on local achievements. It can be successful on a regional scale. This isn't an issue that's only about the Amazon rainforest or the Great Barrier Reef or the Kalahari. We may not have lions or tigers here, but we do have more than 400 species of amazing birds, and many of which are of global conservation concern, and many of which are as endangered as tigers. It shows that the important work is being done. It highlights the important work being done to understand why specific bird species are declining and the causes behind that. Because if we don't really understand that, we can't be effective at bringing these birds back, stabilizing their populations, or reversing the trends. I'm really excited about the speakers that are joining us today. We have amazing authors on this year's report. As I started to say, when I first came here, I remember the State of the Birds we were working on focused on the Connecticut Bird Atlas. And at that time I thought, wow, this is the best State of the Birds report so far. Then the next year, oh man, this State of the Birds is even better. It seems like every year it's getting to be more relevant and more important. And this is going to be critical for us. And it's going to be setting our conservation tone over the next year for our priorities. And without any further ado, I'm pleased to welcome Pete Mara. He is the professor of Laudato Si professor at Georgetown University and the director of the Georgetown Environment Initiative. Pete actually got his, I don't know if it was his very start, but he got an early start in his conservation career working with Milan Bull out in the Norwalk Islands on, I believe it was Shimon Island, where they were studying the heron rookery out there. And he's gone on to an amazing ornithological career, and he's been very helpful to Connecticut Audubon Society in many ways and on many occasions. Without any further ado, Pete.
Thank you, Patrick, and thanks to everyone for joining today. And I just want to highlight again how important groups like Connecticut Audubon are to local conservation efforts and international conservation efforts. Connecticut Audubon not only does important action on the ground, but they also help to bring people like me, young kids that need more direction and more ways to light their passion, to get them interested in the environment. And Connecticut Audubon and Miley and Dennis Varza and Carl Trischka, some folks way back when in Connecticut Audubon, did that for me. So I'm always going to be indebted to Connecticut Audubon Society, and will always support them every way I possibly can, because they're such a critical group for pushing this cause along. So as Patrick mentioned, I was the senior author on the paper that came out in 2019 reporting this depressing loss of birds, 3 billion total birds, about a third, 29% declines since 1970 or so. And, when we started working on this paper in 2017 or so, starting to analyze the data, it became clear that our worst fears were coming true. And basically, I started to think about, so what are we going to do about this? So when the paper came out, it had the splash that we sort of expected was going to happen. But, you don't publish a paper like that and then go on to the next paper. You sort of have to think about it, because the results sort of shake you to the bones. It shook me to the bones. And we had to start thinking about, what's our response going to be here? And my first thought was, well, what we're doing isn't working. And I've long suspected that, frankly, that, we have to continue to do the sorts of broad scale conservation that we're doing, land protection, removal of threats. But I kind of felt like we needed to think more carefully about the specific declines that were happening with species level declines. What's going on with the rusty blackbird? What's going on with the king eider? What's going on with these 10 common species that are no longer common? Blackbirds, things that, I grew up with in Connecticut. Common nighthawks. I used to, go around in New Haven and hear common nighthawks pinting in such abundance. Now, you probably don't hear many common nighthawks in Connecticut. Golden-winged warblers, wood thrushes. These are all examples of species in Connecticut that have declined drastically in our lifetimes that our future generations may not see. And the fact of the matter is, folks, is that we don't know what's causing the declines of most of these species. We know what the broad scale threats are, but we're not going to remove the broad scale threats across the entire Western Hemisphere. So we have to be much more surgical, much more directed at what we do to stop these declines. And we now have new science that's available to us that we can bring to bear to understand what's going on with these individual species. We also now have broad coalitions of people available, organizations, not just Connecticut Audubon, but National Audubon, and the American Bird Conservancy, the Cornell Lab, academics, Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, government and non-government alike, that are working together collectively to try to solve these problems. So we've started a new group called the Road to Recovery to try to bring together everyone at the species specific level to try to understand why these declines are happening for these specific species. And you're going to hear some examples today about efforts to look at this for species like rusty blackbird and roseate terns and wood thrush. There's many more. In fact, there's about 50 or so that we've identified on this group called the Species on the Brink. Our entire goal, our basic mission, is to use targeted and actionable science to recover North American bird population and lost abundance before they get listed, before they become an endangered or a threatened species. Because once they're on the endangered and threatened species list, then regulatory action happens. So they're closer to extinction, which is something we really want to avoid. It becomes an acrimonious issue for most people involved. It becomes a political debate, and it costs us hundreds of millions of dollars. The sage grouse effort that's going on now is costing us hundreds of millions of dollars, but we can do so much more while they're starting to decline. So what we're trying to do in the Road to Recovery is develop a process for management and recovery of birds before they become threatened. And that means using science. And that's right, more science. And so we're promoting targeted and actionable science for this recovery. And you'll see some examples today. We now have really exciting ways to track birds throughout their full annual cycle. So we're tracking birds as they move from their breeding grounds in places like northwestern Connecticut on their migratory journey in the fall, down to their wintering grounds, and then back again in spring, back to their breeding grounds. So we know where these linked populations are. And we can start using a variety of other techniques to understand their survival, their reproduction, that allows us to really understand where the vital rates that are being impacted are happening. Is it on the wintering grounds? Is it on the breeding grounds? Is it during migration? And where in each of those places is the real impact happening? So we can be much more targeted and get the biggest bang for our buck once we are ready to do the implementation on the ground. So we've actually developed an entire process for this recovery. And we're bringing together some existing recovery teams that are out there for various species and building new teams for species that don't have teams. But we're putting in this management in sort of an organized but a non-regulatory way of these species on the brink that are sliding towards that endangered species listing issue before they get there. And not only that, we're not only including and thinking very carefully about the biological science, the natural science that's necessary. At the same time, we recognize that all of these problems are human-derived problems. So if we don't incorporate the social piece to it, and we don't co-create or co-produce a solution that involves humans and all the stakeholders involved from the very beginning, it's going to be a much harder job. We're going to fail. We're likely to fail. And so we're developing this process, co-producing this process to understand the biology, to get at the limitation, and also involve all the potential stakeholders early on in this co-production process of the natural science and social science. So when we get to that stage of implementation on the ground, it'll probably be a much easier road to hoe to actually solve the problem, because that's where most of the work is going to be. It's going to be the protection of the specific habitat blocks, or the removal of the pesticides. All that's really, really critical. So I'll stop there, but suffice it to say, I'm hopeful. We've done it before with DDT, with the osprey, with bald eagles, with pelicans, with so many other species. We can actually do it again. And I remain hopeful and optimistic that we can pull this together. Thanks very much.
Oh, all right, there. Thank you so much, Pete. That was amazing, and the article's amazing as well. And if you get a chance to listen to the radio show this morning from WNPR, there's a lot of great information there. Our next speaker is another person I've known for a long time, Carol Foss. Just the other day, I was looking at our the sign-in sheet from the first ever meeting of the Friends of Conti, which was up in Turners Falls, Mass, a few years ago, well, in 2005, more than a few years ago. And Carol's name was on that list. I'm not sure if that's where we met. We probably knew each other before that. Yeah, almost certainly, but because we've been both so active in Partners in Flight and stuff. She is the senior advisor for science and policy at New Hampshire Audubon. New Hampshire Audubon is a really key ally of ours. We're very active together in conservation of the Connecticut River. We also work together on ocean issues too, because the coastline of New Hampshire and the Atlantic adjacent to the Long Island Sound are so similar. So without any further, I'd like to ask Carol to speak about rusty blackbirds.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And thank you for this opportunity to share New Hampshire Audubon's rusty blackbird research. If we could have the next slide, maybe. Here we go. The rusty blackbird is a medium-sized songbird that breeds across northern North America from Alaska to the Maritimes and winters in the eastern United States. From wooded swamps in the south to beaver ponds in the north, various kinds of wooded wetlands are key to their habitat throughout the year. Next slide. Historical literature indicates that rusty blackbirds were common to abundant in the early 20th century and became progressively less so after about 1920 and particularly after 1950. More recent data indicate a dramatic decline during the 1970s and a more or less stable population since then at a very low level. Russ Greenberg, who's sort of the godfather of rusty blackbird research, sounded the alarm about the decline of this species and organized the International Rusty Blackbird Working Group in about 2012, I think, which has enabled collaboration of researchers across North America to try and understand why this species is declining and what we can do about it. Next slide. New Hampshire Audubon has been involved in rusty blackbird research since 2009, and our study area includes most of the upper Androscoggin watershed in Coos County, New Hampshire, and Oxford County, Maine. In our study area, rusty blackbirds forage in beaver ponds in varying stages of their cycle, and along low gradient streams, and nest in dense, and I emphasize the dense, stunted or regenerating spruce fir stands. Next slide. Our field season begins in late April or early May with bushwhacking expeditions to remote beaver ponds to look for evidence of rusty blackbird activity. Successful, I guess, next slide. Successful expeditions are followed by nest searching and monitoring to determine how many eggs hatch, and whether the nest gets predated or not. Next slide. When the nestlings are about 7 to 10 days old, the banding team goes into action. And we target the adults near the nest and then remove the nestlings very carefully for processing. Next slide. Let's run through a number of slides because I've got a warning that we need to wrap up. The slide transition is taking longer than we had anticipated.
Yeah, no huge rush, but we are running a little behind schedule, and it's a double lag time for you. I definitely understand.
Okay. Anyway, we band and measure and weigh all the individuals, and in most years, we're also taking blood and feather samples for various collaborative projects with our colleagues as well. So, next slide. Since the discovery of larval bird blowflies parasitizing nestlings in 2015, we've been collecting and analyzing used nests after the breeding season to document the level of parasitism in our population. We finally have enough years of data to start looking at relationships between spring weather and the rate of parasitism. So maybe in another 10 years or so, we'll have enough data to have some insight into whether and how climate change may be affecting the range retraction and population decline. Thanks to Pete, who was then at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center. Whoa, can we go back? We were able to deploy several pinpoint tags in 2018 and recovered one the following year. That bird spent the post-breeding season pre-migration period several miles north of its nesting area. One more, there we go. In Pittsburgh, New Hampshire, and this was really the first clue that the northern forest was important for rusty blackbirds beyond just breeding. Very little was known about where they were spending their time after the nesting season and before they headed south. And as you can see, that bird did not start its migration south until October. And then it spent the winter in a pretty small area on the North Carolina coastal plain. Okay, next slide. We're also using MODIS technology to investigate migratory connectivity of our populations. And as you can see on the right, we would greatly benefit from more receiving stations in the southeastern states, and we're working to encourage that to happen. Okay, one more. So collaborative research within the Rusty Blackbird Working Group has identified high mortality during the non-breeding period, especially for juveniles, as a key factor driving the population decline. We'll be working with available tracking technologies in the next few years to try and tease apart whether that mortality is occurring in the post-breeding pre-migration period or the wintering period, and what is causing that mortality. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And if folks have questions that we don't have time for, feel free to contact me independently.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. It's a great article, a really critical species, and one for which Connecticut is important. We have probably globally significant stopover use of our wetlands along the Connecticut River and the Connecticut River estuary. And obviously we work very hard to conserve the Connecticut River, both New Hampshire Audubon and Connecticut Audubon. And then we also have some important roosts, even in our cities. And there's a really critical wintering area for rusty blackbirds in the city of New Haven itself. So a really critical species for Connecticut and highly globally endangered. Now, our next speaker is Peter Payton. He is the professor and chair at the Department of Natural Resources Science at University of Rhode Island. He wrote this article in collaboration with my distant cousin, Pamela Loring, and both of these, she's a biologist at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Based in Hadley, and both Peter and Pamela and I have worked together for a long time, mostly on regional planning efforts. They're both brilliant, and I'm very much looking forward to this article. Peter. Oh, is Peter muted? Oh, wait.
Okay, yeah, no, I'm good.
Great. Thank you, Peter.
Hi, everybody. So it's a pleasure to talk about terns. I really want to thank Pam Loring and all the other tern biologists who have worked on this species to get this talk together. So if I get to the next slide. So the two species I'm talking about today are roseate and common terns. Roseate tern was federally listed as endangered in 1987, and common tern is a species of concern throughout the region. The interesting thing about these two species is roseate tern does not nest on any islands where there aren't common terns. So common terns can nest by themselves, but roseate terns, at least in the Northwest Atlantic, only nest on islands where they're common terns. If you go to the Caribbean, roseate terns nest by themselves. But so there's this symbiotic relationship between the two species that are critical for the long-term survival of roseate terns. Next. Right, so in Long Island Sound, there's two major tern colonies, and Faulkner Island, which is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Chris Vagos. There's about 2,600 pairs of common terns, and lately there's been about 40 pairs of roseate terns nested on the island. And then for the purposes of today's talk, we're going to claim Great Gull as part of Connecticut. So Great Gull Island has 9,000 pairs, about 9,000 pairs, and it's got about 2,000 pairs of roseate terns, or almost 50% of the population in the Northwest Atlantic nests on Great Gull Island. So these are two critical sites for the long-term persistence of roseate terns in the Northwest Atlantic. Next. So the difference between these two species is that common terns, they tend to nest in open habitats, versus roseate terns really like to nest, at least in the Northwest Atlantic, prefer to nest underneath cover. So they'll take advantage of nest boxes. They'll also nest under vegetation such as seaside goldenrod. So you have to manage, or in the case of Great Gull Island, and boulders and rocks around the edges of the island. So those protected areas are critical for roseate terns. Next. And as Patrick Comins just said, the common terns are the guard dogs of the in the tern colony. So the advantage for roseate terns is that the common terns to be very aggressive, much more aggressive than roseate terns. And so any potential predator that goes to the island, you spend time out on these islands, they'll dive bomb you and try and scare the predators away. It's not always effective for all predators, but that's the strategy for roseate terns, is to nest where the common terns will protect you. Next. So if you look at the picture for roseate terns in the region, so I remember I mentioned they were federally listed as endangered in 1987. So there was about 3,000 pairs in the Northwest Atlantic then. The number has increased up to almost 5,000 pairs in 2018. It's declined slightly since then. So the numbers have been increasing, which you might think, which is good, but there's a lot of concerns about these increases too. And these two times when there's been downturns in the late 1990s and the mid 2000s, a lot of that was related to hurricane events and a lot of mortality that took place during hurricane events. So with climate change and the impacts of the major storms can have impacts, and is a critical concern for roseate terns. Next. So one of the reasons why roseate tern numbers haven't increased, at least in the region, is there's been a lot of efforts to increase the number of nest sites on some of these islands. And as I mentioned earlier, roseate terns will take advantage of nest boxes. So this is a picture taken from Great Gull Island, and you can see that one of the distinguishing characteristics for roseate terns is those long outer rectrices, and you can see them sticking out of these nest boxes in this photograph. So they've taken advantage of this nest box program, and the numbers have increased. So that's a good story. The problem is that with so many things affecting them, particularly the availability of forage fish is not necessarily always high productivity, but that's been a positive thing about with roseate terns. Next. So the major concern is this just shows the relationship between colony size and the number of pair roseate terns in the region. So there's a number of small colonies, but they don't really account for much of the population. And even medium-sized colonies from 50 to 200 birds, it accounts for about less than 10% of the population. Where most of the population in the Northwest Atlantic nests are on 3 colonies: Great Gull Island, Bird Island, and Ram Island in Massachusetts. And so they account for over 90% of the population right now. So, you know, the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket, that's what we've done with roseate terns. So those 3 islands account for now 90% of the population. So if anything happens to those islands, then the population would be really in trouble. There's been a lot of work to try and get them established on other islands, but it hasn't been very successful. That's the direction we're headed. And the major concern for roseate terns with sea level rise, a lot of these key nesting islands in 20 years from now, there won't be a lot of nesting habitat for this species. So there's a lot of concern for the long-term viability of this population. So there's a lot of work being done to restore restore and maintain these critical sites while trying to establish other colonies throughout the region. Next. And that's all that I had to talk about with roseate terns. So hopefully everybody has a chance to see roseate terns and common terns and enjoy them. And there's lots of work to be done with them, but it's been a successful conservation story so far. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Peter. Yeah, the Great Gull Island, we have officially annexed Great Gull Island because, as some of you may know, the volunteer work at Great Gull is based out of Connecticut. The folks come out to the island from Connecticut. So actually, a lot of the best and most dedicated volunteers on the island have come from Connecticut, and a lot from Connecticut Audubon Society members. So
yeah, that's definitely true.
We work very well with Helen. She's a conservation legend, and I really honored to have this excellent article in our State of the Birds this year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now I'd like to welcome Timothy White. All of our speakers today have PhDs in various subjects, so everybody's a doctor who's speaking except me. But Dr. White is an avian biologist in the Environmental Studies program at the U.S. Department of the Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, it's also known as. And this is an agency that we work very closely with. Actually, Timothy and I are on a lot of the same Zooms about planning for offshore renewable energy resources. So since we're running behind, without any further ado, Dr. White.
Great. Okay, looks like I'm unmuted. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Patrick. Yes, I work for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, BOEM. It's a small agency in the Department of the Interior, about 500 employees. So we are responsible for the development of offshore energy resources for the nation, renewable energy like wind, oil, and gas, marine minerals, sand mining for beach renourishment when hurricanes like Hurricane Sandy comes up the coast and scoured Long Island beaches. We are also responsible for doing things like that. Where I am, the Environmental Studies program is a small office where we conduct the studies. We fund and develop and manage science and technology as stewards of the environment to inform the planning process and the permitting process of the activities offshore and to essentially protect the environment. We want to know what's happening out there. So we have a robust science program. We do have, I'll let everyone know, we do have a call for study ideas this year, every year, but it's now through December the 10th. So I'll drop a link in the chat where you can give us yours. If you'd like us to see us do a particular study, you can write that in as many as you want, and we'll review and try to make that happen. So for this particular article, I wrote about long-tailed ducks and white-winged scoters. Before I came to BOEM, I was doing a lot of surveys with NOAA on ships and Fish and Wildlife aerial surveys for seabirds, looking at seabird population distributions and abundance, and planes flying low and slow, and different kind of aircraft to record where these animals are. Here I'm writing about long-tailed ducks and white-winged scoters on the shoals, Nantucket shoals, south of the Payton Islands. We conducted aerial surveys with the ANAPS program and other programs with Fish and Wildlife. ANAPS stands for the Atlantic Marine Assessment Program for Protected Species, and that's a collaboration between BOEM, Fish and Wildlife, Navy, and NOAA, ship-based surveys and aerial surveys. And what I found during that time was there was a very, very large population, as many of you know, wintering population of long-tailed ducks on the shoals. So we flew that for several years. These boxes here represent, if you could imagine, I don't have the aerial survey transects here, but if you can imagine aerial survey lines going from east to west, right in between these boxes, around 9 kilometers apart. We surveyed all this area heavily from Maine down to the Straits of Florida. That includes Long Island Sound and Nantucket Shoals, Payton Islands. What we found is high concentrations of the ducks on the shoals. When I was in BOEM, I brought the data back in 2008, 2009 to BOEM. I told them about this. I mapped the oceanography and the prey distribution. We looked at some of the stomachs of long-tailed ducks. And there's a heavy commute that goes back and forth from Nantucket Sound to Nantucket Shoals of long-tailed ducks. Back then in 2009, it would be hundreds of thousands of long-tailed ducks in the morning flying over the west end of Nantucket, disappearing over Nantucket Shoals, and we were trying to find out what the distribution was on the shoals and what they were feeding on. And I wrote a paper about this in Ecosphere. I won't go in the ESA Ecosphere to map the oceanography. But they were lined up against a front on the west side of a tidal front where this oceanography aggregates the prey, and they were heavily organized across this western front, as were white-winged scoters, where it's a heavy clam abundance, and the long-tailed ducks are feeding on a small crustacean, like a shrimp-like crustacean called an arthropod. There's swarms of them there. But we also visited, surveyed Long Island Sound, and were able to map some of the spots where you're familiar with white-winged scoter and long-tailed duck aggregations from shore, and some of these aerial surveys verified those aggregations. So what these actual boxes represent is not the complete distribution and abundance of long-tailed ducks and white-winged scoters, but it represents high densities and how often they occur. So you can think of it as high densities of long-tailed ducks and white-winged scoters and that occur there often. So we're visiting a spot, we often see them over and over and over again. The pink boxes represent the long-tailed duck aggregations, high aggregations, and persistent. The hashed aggregations represent the mixed species flocks of white-winged scoters and long-tailed ducks. Sometimes they use the same area, sometimes they were tightly interwoven with the mixed species groups. So they're persistent hotspots. So like Peter Maher said, there's, and Dr. Payton said, there's these spots that are very special. They're not spread evenly across the ocean, but they're honed in on very specific locations, which is important. When I brought the information to BOEM before I worked for BOEM, they acknowledged the shoals was a very important spot for the ducks, and they removed a lot of these lease blocks where offshore wind might have gone. So that was a interesting and valuable conservation effort on BOEM's part to acknowledge that area. There's more work to do. We're always vigilant and doing studies offshore to recognize and map these important areas for seabirds. So if you'd like to see the long-tailed duck commute, I'll finish here by saying this. In my paper, I have a very amateur video of the long-tailed duck commute on the west end of Nantucket. I was out there one day, I don't know, maybe in 2010, 2009, and I had a video camera, and the ducks came close to shore, and I just happened to shoot them. Very amateur, but it captures just a blizzard of birds that fly by. That's in the supplementary information at the bottom of that paper if you'd like to look at that. That's all I have for now. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Tim. You know, as you alluded to, there are some important concentrations of long-tailed duck in Long Island Sound. And in fact, we have two globally important bird areas on the Connecticut side. One of is in the waters off of Long Beach. You know, I think that should probably be expanded to also the waters off of Milford Point. Yeah. And then the other area is around the Norwalk Islands, although the latter is not publicly announced as an important bird area, so I didn't say anything about it. But it is recognized scientifically. So thank you so much. It's a really important species of global conservation concern, and we have an important critical role for them here in Connecticut. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Calandra Stanley. She is a postdoctoral researcher at Georgetown University, and she's going to be talking about one of my favorite species, the wood thrush.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. And yes, the wood thrush are one of my favorite species as well. Next slide. Unfortunately, the wood thrush have been the poster child for declining forest songbirds for decades now. And over the last 50 years, their global population has declined by 60%, according to Breeding Bird Survey data, which is what I am showing here on the graph. In Connecticut, they have declined at an average rate of 2.4% per year over that same time period. And so really to address declines in migratory birds, one of the central tenets that have emerged in the last 20 years is the importance of taking a holistic approach to understanding the factors driving these declines. And so what I mean by that is by making sure we are examining populations across their annual cycle to understand the factors impacting populations during all seasons. Next slide, please. Unlike some migratory bird species, we've known for a long time the general distribution of wood thrush across the annual cycle. So they breed in eastern United States, which is the area in yellow in this map, and then they winter in Central America and southern Mexico, which is the area in blue. But to really understand what is happening to a specific population of wood thrush, so for example, the wood thrush that breed in Connecticut, we need to understand how events during other periods of the annual cycle, when they're outside of Connecticut, how those periods are impacting them. Therefore, we really need to understand how populations are connected between their breeding, winter, and migration areas. And so, do particular breeding populations all winter together, like I've shown on this map with the black population? Or are populations more like the purple breeding population on the map, where they split up during the winter period and go to different locations? The term we use to describe this separation or staying together is called migratory connectivity. And so this describes the degree to which populations are linked between periods of annual cycle. So do they stay together or do they split up? Next slide, please. And for smaller species like migratory songbirds, technological limitations have really hindered our ability to decipher these patterns of migratory connectivity, because once a bird leaves our study plot, we really have no idea where they went. And it's really only been the last 15 years that tracking technologies have now become small enough to be used on songbirds, like Carol was showing on the rusty blackbirds. And so part of the reason I actually started working with wood thrush was because they were one of the only birds at the time that were big enough to carry these new miniaturized tracking technologies. So first we had archival light level geolocators, which is the tag that's up on the top there. And then later, miniaturized archival GPS geolocators became available. And so to build a migratory connectivity map for wood thrush, we use both of these two technologies. Next slide, please. So we deployed both types of tags on 15 different populations across the breeding range and winter range of wood thrush. So in total, we deployed tags at 11 breeding populations, which are shown on the map in the circles and stars, and 4 wintering populations. And so this was a huge collaborative effort that took over a decade and was a collaboration across multiple organizations, including some Audubon organizations. Next slide, please. We were able to retrieve over 100 tags from wood thrush across the breeding and wintering range, and we discovered a lot of really interesting things about the migration ecology and movement behavior of wood thrush. But the main result of this research was the production of this migratory connectivity map, which I'm showing here. And so overall, we found that wood thrush have what we call a leapfrog migration pattern. And so birds that breed in the northeastern breeding range, so shown here in the red, tend to winter in the most southern extent of the wintering range, so in Costa Rica and Nicaragua, while Midwestern and southern breeding populations of wood thrush, shown here in yellow, tend to winter more in the northern wintering range in Mexico and northern Central America. So now we know if we wanted to understand the factors driving declines of wood thrush populations in Connecticut, we also need to make sure to understand what's happening to their wintering populations that will be mostly in Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Honduras. And so building this migratory connectivity map was really the first step to being able to understand the key factors driving population declines. And for wood thrush, researchers have since found that deforestation on both their breeding and wintering grounds are key threats to the species. But whether forest loss on the breeding ground or forest loss on the wintering ground is more important to a population varies across the breeding range. So really for wood thrush, finding ways to restore and conserve forested habitat on the breeding, wintering, and migratory routes will be key for the species persistence. Next slide, please. That's all I had to share with you, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Please feel free to email me at a later time. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Calandra. Wait a second. So wait, my schedule is mixed up here. I believe next is going to be Dr. Brooke Bateman, who is the Director of Climate Science for the National Audubon Society, is going to be talking about the connection between birds and climate change, specifically in Connecticut. And if you get a chance to listen to this morning's Where We Live, which is on WNPR's website, she and Dr. Mara were on this morning, and Tom, and all just did an amazing job. So definitely listen to that. But without any further ado, Brooke, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. So the component of the State of the Birds that I wrote about today is that birds are telling us it's time to act on climate change. And I'm specifically going to talk about natural climate solutions as a pathway forward, and what we can do now to take action on climate change. Next slide. Next slide. And you can advance it one. So we already heard from Pete and from everybody that previously that talked to me that we have seen a great amount of loss in our birds across North America since 1970. 1 in 4 birds are gone. We know that we're in the midst of a biodiversity crisis, not just in North America, but globally. And birds are really just sort of this canary in the coal mine, this signal that we're seeing detrimental effects of changes that we've been seeing, global change in our bird populations. Next slide. But the thing that I want to pivot to is that global warming and climate change pose a threat to birds, and that we can think of climate change as a threat multiplier. So we have already an existing crisis that birds are declining dramatically, and climate change is only going to make that worse. So in our report in 2019, 389 bird species on the brink, we found that 2/3 of birds in North America are at risk of potential extinction, large amounts of range loss, and potentially really detrimental effects from climate change, especially if we don't do anything now to start sort of stabilize our climate. Next slide. The really good news from our science, though, is that when we looked at the different amounts of climate change into the future, if we can take action, dramatic action now to sort of stabilize climate change and what we call climate mitigation, which is trying to pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere or stop putting more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, that 76% of those species that are at high risk to climate change will be better off. They'll see less range loss. They'll have more stable and promising futures. And so there's some hope built into this, showing that if we can take action, that we can make some meaningful differences to prevent future changes and detrimental declines in bird populations with climate change. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about, we have the biodiversity crisis, but we also have a climate crisis. And so the IPCC and IPBES put out this report a couple years ago. It was also talked a lot about in the COP26 in Glasgow, which is where all different countries got together to talk about what we can do about climate change. And what these reports are saying is that we previously have kind of tackled biodiversity loss and climate change independently. And what we're starting to realize is that we can't do that. They are so intertwined and that they play on each other. The biodiversity loss contributes to the climate crisis and the other way around. And so we really need to be mindful of tackling these two issues together. Next slide. So as part of the component for this, we know there's two sort of things that we need to do to sort of address climate change and biodiversity loss, and particularly with the lens of birds. We need to protect the places that birds need now and into the future. We call this climate adaptation. This is anything that will build resilience into the system that will help the birds or whatever wildlife are in those areas cope with the inevitable amount of climate change and biodiversity issues that we have now. But we also need to take actions personally, but also urge state and federal level changes to address the root changes of climate change, that greenhouse gas emissions, which is called climate mitigation. Next slide. Natural climate solutions are a path forward to do both, to provide both climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And it's really a win-win solution. So basically what it means is that by restoring ecosystems and protecting ecosystems and managing them in a specific way, we can both lead to climate adaptation by protecting biodiversity and building that resilience, as well as pull carbon out of the atmosphere into plants. Next slide. And you can advance it one. So these natural climate solutions that are also called nature-based pathways really are a fantastic way to, as I said, get to both climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And the way that we go forward with that is by either protecting areas, protecting forests that already harness a lot of carbon that are stored in the trees and in the roots and in the soil, protecting wetlands and grasslands. We can also manage these forests in a way that's more sustainable and better, that will make it pull more carbon out of the atmosphere every year. And then a really big component of this is restoring areas, restoring suburban and urban areas that have, so we can have more forests and native plants, restoring wetlands on our coasts. These natural climate solutions provide a really already cost-effective, already proven pathway forward, and will provide roughly 1/3 of the climate action that we need by 2030. Next slide. So climate in Connecticut, in Connecticut, there's already some policies in place to sort of get to 80% below the 2001 levels by 2050. So essentially, there's different pathways forward to sort of stabilizing climate change. And so I think that one is these emission targets by thinking about renewable energy. But next slide. We can look at natural climate solutions, and our report, Audubon's Natural Climate Solutions, provides a framework for this. So if you look at the next slide, I'll show you some of the parts of Connecticut, and then we can move forward. So a fantastic thing is that if we look across all of the different ecosystems, which you can read more about in our report, Connecticut has up to 85% of its, the entire state has potential to either be an area to protect, whether that be a forest system that's already providing a lot of carbon benefits, and also climate strongholds, these areas that are important for birds now and into the future. But there's also a lot of areas that we could restore. We could restore areas even in your own backyard, our coastal wetlands. Some of these areas can really provide a lot of habitat for birds into the future, and also pull more carbon out of the atmosphere and help fight climate change at the same time. Next slide. And this will help birds. 65% of our forest birds in Connecticut are vulnerable to climate change. It can help species that we've already heard about, like the wood thrush that's already declining. Next slide. And also restoring our wetlands can help species like the salt marsh sparrow that is going to be at risk to sea level rise, and restoring our coastal wetlands that have a really big amount of carbon per acre, can draw 2.5 times more carbon per year if we do restoration efforts that will help birds and people and climate change. Next slide. And that's it for me. The bottom line, what's good for birds is also good for stabilizing climate change. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in Connecticut. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. Brooke works for National Audubon Society, and I just have to talk about a little bit about our special relationship with National. We are really, we work very closely together with the state office here in Connecticut, Audubon Connecticut, which is also part of Audubon New York as well. And, we work together on regional issues because Long Island Sound is straddled by the two states. We work, Vermont also has a strong presence in the National Audubon Society, so we work together on Connecticut River issues. And of course, throughout the state with the Audubon Connecticut staff, and then down in DC, we act as a liaison between National and some of the other independents as well. So I can't overstate the importance of our partnership with National Audubon. This next one was going to be given by another really critical partner of ours. That's New Jersey Audubon Society, David Mizrahi, who I've known forever. And he's talking about one of my favorite species, and that is Semi-Palmette Sandpipers. And I'm going to try to do this very quickly and summarize it. His article is amazing. I definitely encourage you to check it out. Basically, Semi-Palmette Sandpipers are one of these migratory species which is facing threats on all three legs of its tripod of survival, if you will. They're facing threats on their nesting grounds because of climate change, because of changes to wetlands in the high Arctic tundra in which they nest, generally west of Hudson Bay over to Alaska within the Arctic Circle. And they're also facing increased predation from things like red foxes and competition from the overabundant snow geese. But that's not all they need. Yes, breeding grounds are critical for shorebirds. And amazingly, the adults leave the nesting grounds before the juveniles can even fly yet. And they gather on the shores of Hudson Bay. And they actually fly nonstop from Alaska to Hudson Bay, at times as far as away as Alaska. And then a couple of weeks later, the juveniles follow them, show up at the same place. Then they fly nonstop from there to Connecticut and places like New Jersey, basically the northeast coast of the United States. There, the birds arrive exhausted and emaciated, and they need to fatten up. So they spend a few weeks going out on tidal cycles at places like Milford Point and the mouth of the Connecticut River, and and Sandy Point in West Haven, and they fatten up, and they go out and they forage on the tidal flats when the tide is low, and they roost in certain places when the tides are high. And if they can't fatten up, they have to fly nonstop from here to Suriname, or French Guiana, the north coast of South America. They don't touch land between the time they leave Connecticut's shore and the time they reach South America. And then that cycle repeats in the spring. So our shores, again, we like to think of, conservation issues as things that are happening in South America or in the Arctic. But if it isn't for places like Milford Point for these birds to fatten up, and places like Stratford Point and Milford Point as well, and Sandy Point, for them to rest when it's high tide, they're not going to be successful in their migratory journey. And it doesn't matter how good their wintering habitat or their nesting habitat is. And this is a species that's declined by about 80% over the past, I think it's only over the past 30 years, whereas a lot of the songbirds are over the last 50 years. We've been shorebird populations are more difficult to track. So this species is almost emblematic of our importance in the global picture of conservation here in Connecticut. We have at least I think we have 4 globally important bird areas for this species: the mouth of the Connecticut River, Sandy Point in West Haven, Milford Point in the mouth of the Housatonic, and then also Long Beach in Stratford. So some really critical places that Connecticut Audubon works with National Audubon and other partners, the municipalities, the state, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to try and reduce disturbance to our migrating semi-palmetted sandpipers each year as part of our Audubon Alliance conservation efforts. And I think we're making a difference for the species, increasing awareness and slowly reducing the disturbance at their critical high tide roosting areas. All right, we are just about out of time, but we have 2 more pieces to cover, and I would now like to call Milan Bull up, celebrating his 50th year with the Connecticut Audubon Society. Oh, he's still muted. If you could unmute.
Okay, there we go. All right, thank you, Patrick, and thanks everyone for joining us on this really important State of the Birds issue. We know that billions of birds are gone, but what can we do as people on the ground, as Audubon members, friends, and colleagues can do to help bring back some of our birds? So what we've done is we put together some recommendations that we at Connecticut Audubon Society will be acting on, and we hope that our friends, neighbors, as I mentioned, colleagues, and the public can actually do to help our professional experts with this recovery of some of these birds. Well, there's a couple of things. There's 2 important bills before Congress that we need to get passed very, very quickly. One is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, which was introduced a few years ago. It's kind of struggling along. This would direct some $1.3 billion of existing revenue annually to state wildlife conservation efforts. That is a lot of moolah. And in Connecticut, that would mean about $11.8 million annually from the fund. That's a complete game changer for wildlife protection in Connecticut. This is getting close, and we need to get it passed. So we're certainly working hard. I know Patrick is writing letters on the phone call, shaking people up all the time to try to get this passed. This is really, really important. The other one is the Migratory Bird Protection Act of 2021. This would not only replace, but it would enhance the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. So those are 2 important acts in Congress that we need to pass like right away if we can. Now, we all know, of course, that land acquisition is the best way to protect habitat, but the state has not even come close to its official goal of protecting 21% of the state land in Connecticut by 2023. So we need to push this forward. We need to get this moving forward, get Governor Lamont and the General Assembly to act more quickly on this this way to protect more of our open space. And the General Assembly and Governor Lamont, they must also fully fund and protect the Community Investment Act, because that's a very, very important source of funding for open space. Also, we should call on our state officials to increase the funding for the Open Space and Watershed Land Acquisition Grant Program. and the Recreation and Natural Heritage Trust Program. These programs are critically important as we look for new and innovative ways to fund land conservation and stewardship. So we need to find more land, we need to protect more land, and we need to steward it the right way. Also, and importantly, we have a really cool and excellent tool now to prioritize areas for species of greatest conservation need. That tool is being developed right now, and it's called the Connecticut Bird Atlas Program. Once this Bird Atlas Program is fully developed, we need to analyze it. And this will give us strategies to protect and improve all our bird habitats, utilizing this proactive approach to identify the most important places for all these bird species that we're concerned about. So the Connecticut Bird Atlas will be a really important tool for bird protection, and we need to get it analyzed. And finally, and equally important, are what individual residents, you and I and our members and people that we know can help to reduce the number of birds that die accidentally from preventable causes. Outdoor cats, for instance. These critters kill an estimated 4 billion birds in North America alone every year. Think about that. Outdoor cats kill almost 4 billion birds a year. We need to educate, and Connecticut Audubon has been doing that. Pete Maher has been very effective in that as well. Educating people about how important it is to keep your cats indoors. And also, there's some new innovative approaches to preventing window strikes. There's some new technology that creates new types of windows that will identify this solid air that birds see as actual an impediment for flight. So these are the things we can do. Eliminate the reduce use of pesticides on your property, plant native species, and we'll be moving ahead. So these are the things that Connecticut Audubon Society is going to be working hard on. We hope you will too. And thank you again very, very much for all our great authors for this year's State of the Birds effort. And back to Patrick.
Great. Thank you so much. This was an amazing collection of articles and of presentations today. And I want to thank all of the authors for helping. I also want to thank, of course, Tom Anderson for his hard work on this, and Miley, of course, and Chuck Watson, Paul Fusco, Julian Huff, our board, our volunteers, our members. You make all of this possible. I can tell you that our top priority is making a dent in all these issues and bringing the birds back to stabilize the declines and to start to increase populations here in Connecticut. And, you know, to quote Miley, who's been here celebrating his 50th year now, he said to me the other day, "I've never seen Connecticut Audubon Society so vibrant and so making such a difference for conservation in Connecticut." And, you know, that makes me very happy, because that's what I care about. I want to make a difference. I want Connecticut Audubon Society to make Connecticut a better place for birds, other wildlife, and their habitats. And we can't do any of that without you. Thank you so much.